I'm Ellen Mickiewicz, the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Communications and Journalism of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy and professor of public policy and political science. I'm very pleased to share the program today with our esteemed guest, Yegor Gaidar, who is currently the director of the Institute for the Economy in Transition. Dr. Gaidar has had a long and illustrious history at the peak of Russian and before that Soviet intellectual life and politics. He has been the director of the Institute of Economics, the most important agency for economic thought in the Soviet Union. He has been the acting head of government of Russia, the acting minister of economics, and currently head of an institute and chairman of the very important party, certainly in the very beginning of Russia's move to democracy, Russia's democratic choice. I am joined by my colleague at Duke, Michael Newcity, a coordinator of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Duke University. May I ask the first question?
Of course.
Yegor Timurovich. I was quite fascinated with your brilliant lecture last evening when you talked a great deal about the economic changes, the economic infrastructure of the Soviet Union and what the Russian government inherited and the choices that it made. And I was wondering if I could begin by moving more toward the political sphere in which you are equally adept and important. And in doing so, I thought that I would ask you a question that's very specific, but perhaps in so doing to move from the specific to some larger political issues. And my first question then is about the election of 1993, in which you were very intimately involved. And this is an election, as you recall, in the fall of 1993. That was a very important and seminal competitive election in Russia, in which television played a very big role,
Yes.
in which foreign advisors were very controversial, in which many of the issues that surfaced later in politics were first seen. In April of that year, for example, of 1993, during the campaign on the referendum, Ben Goddard, an American consultant, offered his services and produced advertisements, political advertisements for Russian television on behalf of President Yeltsin's agenda in the referendum. That was very controversial. And according to Goddard, in the fall, your party refused his offer of assistance. But in the fall of 1993, there was a different kind of issue involving foreigners when the USAID television public service announcements for the economic voucher program were used to further Russia's democratic choice. Now, Mark Malloch Brown, at the time in charge of that American program, said that the person responsible for that was a man named Arkady Yevstafiev, who was your colleague Anatoly Chubaiev's press secretary. This is just by way of introduction. I have really two questions. One about how these specific issues actually, in your recollection, happened, but also a larger issue about the role of foreign consultants generally. And a third question about just taking the example of Mr. Yevstafiev, who was said to be responsible for the illegality here, and was later, in 1995, apprehended taking out money with Sergei Lysovsky and possibly laundering.
Probably 96.
I'm sorry, in the presidential election of 1996, a case that was later dropped for lack of evidence. So the third question then has to do with the role of financing and elections from your perspective as one who was involved in all of it. So it's a very big agenda of questions, but you are the one to answer them.
Well, I think you are strongly overestimating my involvement in the practicalities of the election campaign of '93. Let's not forget that I was Deputy Prime Minister in charge of economic policy at the time. I never regarded myself as a big expert on the election campaigns. Of course, I was the leader of the party list, but also I had to deal with the strike of the miners in Vorkuta and Kemerovskaya Oblast. We had enormous problems with the legislation, from the elimination of the food subsidies to the elimination of the import subsidies, and that really was in the center of my attention. I was prepared to go where my colleagues who were in charge of election campaign, first of all Gennady Burbulis and Alexei Golovkov, would tell me to go, to loyally fulfill the functions that they would put on me, but I was not running election campaign. I do remember that was some episode afterwards when some kind of scandal was connected with this advertising come off. I do not think that, as the results of the campaign have shown, I don't think that helped us a lot. As to the use of American consultants in the campaigns, to my knowledge, they were either zero or not important. Maybe it is because of lack of my information, because my knowledge was very general. But on the level on which we discussed the issues, we had some kind of consultants asked before, general discussions, but I do not remember that any of the Western consultants played a role, not serious, but the role about which I would be informed at the time.
Could you tell me...
It is a part of broader problem.
Yeah.
See, when you are looking at the Russian events in all of the fields, not only in the elections, information, advertising, economic policy making, etc., it's more or less inevitable that those who are analyzing the events from outside, for instance from the States, are looking at them from a little bit unclear perspective, because who are partly the source of the information? The persons who were somehow involved to bigger and to lesser degree in various consultations with the Russian government and Russian authorities, Russian political parties. Well, it is the position from which it's very easy to overestimate your own influence and your importance. Really, I know some people who were instrumental and important in the elaboration of various concrete economic policies in Russia, for instance. But I have heard about a lot of persons who never played any role at all. And the highest moment in which career was the half of the hour discussion with one of the vice ministers of the economy, who are telling how big was the influence in the economic transformation in Russia, etc. So very general answer, it doesn't apply to everybody. But of course, from my point of view, notion here about the importance of the international advice, generally in Russian transition, is strongly overestimated.
Just so that you know, methods, I agree. It could well be overestimated if one had one side. But luckily, I've been able to talk to Gennady Burbulis and Bragin and Poptsov and a number of others from the other side. So I'm just talking about where it comes together. But as the head of a party, though I understand not involved in these details, but in thinking about the Russia of today, of the past and the future, what kinds of thoughts do you have about the role of money and the role of elections and parties?
Well, we are a young democracy with a very young party system, which was non-existent a few years ago, and still very weak. Демократическая Россия, which played an absolutely crucial role in the destructions of the Soviet Union and Soviet regime, in the victory on the elections in 89, 90, and then Yeltsin's 91, never had anything like an organization. It was very weak institutionally. and that was one of the reasons why it fell apart in 92, 93. Now you have seen the history of the election success of Единство, which of course cannot be named as a political party, at least at the present stage. From my point of view, we have one strong, well-established party, which is Communist Party, and few political entities which became the parties. For instance, Yablok. It is a political entity, political organization, which was big institution at the beginning, which was created from the club of the supporters of Yavlinsky. But then, with years, created some kind of structures, personnel, institutions, etc. And now, of course, it's not a strong party, but could be regarded as a proto-party. Russian democratic choice is another example of the similar development when could not, of course, be compared with the communists by the mobilization capacity and ability to do door-to-door campaign, but we have organizations in the major region of Russia. We could collect people, we could distribute information, etc. So, first of all, we are in the very, very beginning of the process of the formation of the party structures. Money. Money, of course, is important in the politics everywhere, including in the Russian politics. Different kind of influence and different kinds of money. For instance, it is not always possible to make a single calculation. For instance, how much costed the support of NTV to Yabloko during 93, 95 and 99 campaign. What is in the money? I don't know. How many would you like to pay to get this kind of support? I don't know. The existence of the 200 regional communist newspapers, part of them financed, of course, through various means by the local administrations which are communist oriented. That is the asset. How much it costs? Well, for instance, to re-establish the similar one, you would need an unbelievable amount of money.
Okay, Michael?
I have a broad question that I'd like to ask you. If this were January of 1992 instead of January of 2000, what would you do differently?
Well, in a very specific technical ways. Of course, well, first of all, let's divide the issue in two. If we would be back in January year 92 and I would be nominated as Tsar of Russia, or I would be nominated as deputy prime minister in charge of economy and finance. If the answer is if I would be nominated as Tsar of Russia, I would do definitely everything. In a practical matters, if you are nominated as a deputy prime minister in charge of economy and finance, you have a government, president, influence of the president, governors, parliament, Verkhovny Soviet, etc., 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 republics of the Soviet republics, new independent states, joint economic zone, etc., joint financial zone, joint money. Well, of course, in the details, I would do a lot of things differently. For instance, probably I would pursue then Yeltsin to liberalize oil prices immediately in January and not wait as we thought until the April, until the end of the heating season. I don't think it would radically change the situation. But of course, there are a lot of technical things I would do in a different way. Strategically, I think I would do exactly the same. But of course, I would be much more confident that we are right.
One issue or one specific technical policy that I was curious about was the way in which privatization was conducted, voucher privatization. Would you have considered making it less easy for the individual citizens to transfer their vouchers so as to prevent managers and others from accumulating the vouchers? And
probably not. I have seen the experience of these attempts, for instance, in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They hadn't persuaded me that it would be better. Voucher privatization is, first of all, not a technical problem at all. It's purely and only political and social problem. And I do dislike, as I mentioned many times, a lot of things in the law which were regulating our privatization program, and I would do a lot of things differently if we would have free hands. But it is always not the attempt to elaborate some kind of a technical perfect strategy and then implementing it. It's the attempt to create kind of a coalition which make it possible to make this process going on in a legal framework.
Was it, looking back on that period now, do you think it was ever possible that you could have achieved that sort of a coalition? Or was it always inevitable that the sort of conflicts that made privatization and other economic reform policies difficult?
Well, we achieved the coalition. It was the coalition which made the privatization possible. It was an unpleasant coalition. It was a coalition in which we had to give a lot to the managers of the enterprises, because other way around you would not have the legal privatization. It was the coalition because the crucial point in the program, second variant, was generally supported and invented by the communist fraction in Russian Verkhovny Soviet, and it never existed in the first draft of the privatization program, etc. So it was the coalition which made it possible.
How do you explain the very different experience or success in, say, Poland and Russia? I mean, is it a difference of size? Is it a difference of policy? I mean,
well, it's quite clear. It is first of all a difference in the duration of the communist regime, it's difference of the nature of the communist regime, and difference of the general situation in the Polish and in the Russian elites. In Poland, when the communism collapsed, you still had the millions of people who had the market experiences, who had understanding of the normal life, who had the children that were influenced by them. So for Poles, it was evident that there was the normal life, we have seen it, we have to restore the normal life. In Russia, there was no such experience. It's not the just simple difference of 20 years. It's the difference of the general public perception of what was not, what is possible and not possible. So it's enormous difference. Probably the most important difference for the post-socialist transition was the difference between those who were there for 3 generations, 2 generations. Like, look at, for instance, Baltic states. Evident example. That's the first. The second, communism never was born from within Poland. It was not the result of the Polish Revolution. It was imposed on Poland by the Russian bayonets during the Second World War and after the Second World War. So there was always a very strong national inclination to regard the socialism as something which is Aryan. The fact that it was not only the collapse of the socialist regime, but also regained independence, because Poland, of course, was not an independent state during the communist regime, of course, played an enormous role. I would add to this the fact that in Poland, civil society existed even during the communist period. Still, you had the Catholic Church, you had the private agriculture, you had the various legal or illegal organizations of the civil society, including Solidarity. In the Soviet Union, all of this destroyed much more intensively. And because of the combination of these factors, in Poland it was relatively easy to create a relatively broad coalition of the elites in favor of the general pattern of development. Of course, there was a lot of internal struggles, populist propaganda in the election campaigns, but when election campaign is over, then governments supported by the post-communists are promoting more or less the same policy like Leszek Balcerowicz with a change of some wording, and then you have a ministers of finance like Kalotka, who may be a difficult personality, but who is competent evidently, and then you have the continuation of the policy, because the Polish elite do see the goal. The goal is to bring Poland back to the normal world, to integrate Poland in Europe. In Russia, the period of the socialism was much longer. The level of distortion was much higher. The elimination of the civil society much more radical. And of course, the communism was not imposed on Russia, but was the result of the Russian internal development. And for Russia, the crash of the socialist empire was not the independence, but the loss of the empire, which is not easy, as we have seen by the experience of, for instance, France and Britain. And then on the top of all of this, we had a very serious division in the elites about the general direction of transformation. And you had a substantial part of the elite which wanted to make Russia normal, democratical market economy close to the West. And you had another part which all the time dreamed about restoration of the old empire. And so nothing was assured in economic policy, and the struggle was much more intensive. So it's easy to understand that the path for the to regain sustainable economic growth was much more difficult in Russia.
One policy that they've pursued in Poland, the Czech Republic, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe that has not been attempted anywhere in the former Soviet Union other than the Baltic states is to adopt laws on lustration. And I'm curious as to whether, I'm not sure whether or not they've had more than symbolic significance in places like Poland, but I'm curious whether you think that there should have been some sort of, again, if you were Tsar of Russia, whether there should have been an attempt to change the political, social, and economic elites through lustration or some other way in Russia.
Well, it was the matter that was discussed in Russia.
It was discussed?
It was discussed, of course. It was discussed in 1991, 92. Well, from my point of view, it was impractical in Russia. First of all, the elite in Russia, political and economical, was for a much longer period of time very much incorporated into the structures of the Communist Party. Because it was longer, because it was imperial party, etc. In Poland or Czech Republic especially, you could find existing elites which were outside of the Communist Party, which were expelled from party, for instance, after 90 events of 68, or never was there, etc. In Russia, these non-communist elites were very weak and very much unable to rule. To whom to expel? Yeltsin, who was the Politburo member, and also the leader of the anti-communist revolution. So from my point of view, it was rather impractical discussion.
I have a question of if, and I realize this is a big if Mr. Putin were to be elected president in March, I have a question about the different claimants for resources. Now, last night you made, I think, the important point that there were some positive elements, some positive solutions being arrived at in Russia. So you gave a varied picture. On the other hand, there will be claimants, I think, for the allocation of resources, certainly having to do with health, having to do with state employees, teachers, miners, infrastructure, the military, and many, many others. In your view, if you were at that point economic advisor, where do you think, what do you think would be the best sequence in terms of the allocation of resources, of attention, of problem solving among all the different areas that are claiming?
I would first of all allocate resources to the core functions of the government, for the functions which are essential for the functioning of the government as a government. As you, of course, do know, at the beginning of this century, American government used to spend approximately 4 percentage points of the GDP, American GDP. And the major part of this, as everywhere in the world, was going for the functioning of the government itself. So for to make for the defense, for the legal system, for the law implementation, for the law collection. And then only on the basis when these functions are well fulfilled, then you have the functioning government that could produce economic growth, the results of which you could distribute, and then increase your expenditures on healthcare, healthcare, education, social protection, etc. If you do not have functioning government, the idea is that you could promise something to the pensioners, to the teachers, etc., is usually not very realistic. You could promise. Promises are easy and cheap, as we have seen in Russian recent history. Fulfillment is difficult. So from my point of view, key priorities now is basic functions of the state, legal system, which should be properly financed, law implementation, that should be properly financed, tax collection, that should be properly financed. When and if you have these priorities, it doesn't mean, first of all, giving them money. That means giving them clear signals what should be done in these systems to increase the average pay of those employed there. When and if you have a functioning state, if and when you had created the preconditions for sustainable economic growth, you have the serious resources that could be distributed, that could be used on other fields of the social policy, of which, from my point of view, the education would be the first, because to lose the enormous potential which we have in the education will be extremely dangerous for a long-term perspectives of the Russian economy. Of course, there are a lot of reserves in all of these fields. For instance, healthcare. Of course, we are going through the process of de facto privatization of a lot of healthcare financing, which goes on the practice, which all of the surveys are showing us. Supplementary financing. We have the law on which healthcare should be provided by the state. State do not have the financial resources to provide the healthcare of necessary quality. So it provides some resources, partly to the budget, partly to the healthcare insurance. But of course, the population also is providing the resources to the healthcare. I would prefer it to be done legally, in a legal way. It's not easy because of the constitution, you have to change the constitution. You can do a lot to improve the quality of this financing, to remove most evident distortions there. Distortions between anomalies connected with the poor interconnection between budgetary financing and healthcare insurance financing. You could improve the quality of your purchases of the medicines, which is poor and to a serious extent corrected with corruption. You could seriously redistribute resources between the hospitals and the ambulatoriums in the favor of ambulatorium treatment, because it's much more efficient. So you can do a lot in healthcare, improving the real financing of the needs, but do not promise that you will deliver a lot of new money before you created the preconditions under which this money will really appear.
Do you think, or in what way would such a, if it happens, such a Putin government, is what we would be talking about, with the parliament the way it is, in what way do you think the government could best make its case, find which are the best allies that it would find in this kind of economic plan on the one hand, and on the other hand, since you are talking about a sequence, how then should the government treat the persuasion or the mobilization of the population, which has been waiting precisely for this kind of improvement, which you say cannot be promised but has to be waited for appropriately. What would best ensure the compliance and mobilization of both the population and the elites?
The better strategy in this situation is to tell the truth, as usual. We will have the new president elected in this April. We do not need to go to the next parliamentary elections during the next 4 years. In this parliament, the president will have a substantial majority. If There's a lot of things that should be done in Russia, not to fight various political battles, but exactly to improve the quality of life of Russian population. That is the goal. Not to speak about it, but to do it. And to do it, Putin, if he will be elected, will have a lot of constitutional, legal and political possibilities. The problem is whether he will be able to use it.
Whether he'll be able to use it, and what do you think would be most important in terms of his being able or not being able to?
I think it's first of all his ability to create a working team in the government, which will be able to work together, which will have clear perspectives, which will not only know what should be done, but also how it should be done. Because the problems with this stage of the post-socialist transition is that all of the problems are not easy problems. They are organizationally difficult problems. It's not like price liberalization, which is politically difficult and dangerous, but easy. It is, for instance, deregulation and serious fight against corruption in few agencies like fire inspection and sanitary and control in Russia is a tough problem. You need a lot of good, non-corrupt, qualified personnel to do it. So it's difficult, it's complicated.
I study the Russian legal system, and so I'm very interested in the whole problem associated with reform of Russian law and legal institutions. But over the course of time, I've come to view that no matter how many laws you write or how many institutions you create, that ultimately the most important reform is to create the proper attitude, the proper culture. And I'm curious how important you think questions of culture are as a condition for Russian reform, and also how you go about changing culture.
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with you, and have many times declared it. I think it is absolutely crucial. The problem is that it is the tasks where you need years and the years and the years. There is no strategy which will change culture which was created during the generations in a few months. No such a strategy. You need a long history of the functioning of the imperfect but functioning market mechanisms, of functioning monetary economy, of the competition, of the successes and failures, reputations which are built and destroyed, etc. You need to push in these directions, and you have to understand that if Europe needed a few centuries to build this culture, you should not expect that whatever you do in Russia, you will change this radically in a few months.
But are there any specific, I mean, I completely agree with you, of course, but are there any specific policies that you could see the government implementing in order to try and at least push this movement?
I think what should government take in mind is that that is the real problem. And the problem that should be taken into account in the elaboration of the institutions and policies. For instance, if you do understand that this is the problem, don't put too much hope on it, that you will have a splendid bureaucracy which will be rapid to choose the winners in the economy on the basis of the quality of the project, etc. Try to make your system of the state administration as simple as possible, to limit the powers of the state employees outside the general framework as much as possible, to make the rules as universal as possible, to make the decision-making process as transparent as possible, exactly because you know that these problems are there and will be there.
Yeah. One area that I study is the Russian tax system and
Russian tax system.
And certainly everything you just described, I would think would be good policy in terms of trying to implement in Russian tax policy. But in fact, the Russian tax system has become incredibly complex and I mean, what would you recommend specifically for taxation?
For taxation, I would recommend to adopt as rapidly as can new tax code, which I hope will be considered by the government at the end of February.
Okay, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about foreign policy. In Soviet days and then in Russian times, post-Soviet Russia, there have been declarations from time to time about which are the most important foreign policy objects for either the Soviet Union or Russia. And they would be in concentric circles. These are most important, these are next, these are least. Or this group is no longer important. How do you see the importance of various of the actors on the world scene to the new Russia, say the Russia that will take place after the presidential election?
Well, few of them are evident. United States are extremely important. Europe is extremely important. China is extremely important. India is important. Ukraine is enormously important.
And do you see any kinds of policies, either economic, cultural, political, that you think would help Russia in its relations with these countries that is not being done and ought to be done?
Well, with China, I think our relationship are developing in a quite good direction, and I'm quite satisfied with these dynamics. With India, I think that we are on the right track, and we proved both on our side and the Indian side that if you have this strategic relationship, and you have a lot of very, very radical changes in Soviet Union and Russia, and rather radical changes in India, they do not suffer, and they could be continued, and I am quite satisfied with this. Our relationship with United States and Europe, of course, deteriorated very seriously during the last 2 years. Partly from my point of view because of the mistakes on the American part, partly probably because mistakes on the Russian part, probably because our foreign policy was not concentrated enough on the key issues, probably because our PR on the West is bad and inefficient. But of course, the improvement of the image of Russia in public perception in both Europe and the United States should be one of the priorities. In Ukraine, I think we are moving in the right direction. I'm quite satisfied with the fact that we now see a very good, very qualified and non-corrupt Ukrainian government. I think it's a very good partner in the negotiations about the key problems. I'm glad that Yeltsin was able to sign the agreement with Ukraine on the key problems of political cooperation, and that it was approved by the State Duma.
I noticed that of the near abroad, that is the countries of the former Soviet Union, you mention only Ukraine. And in the past, the near abroad was, at some times, it was the most, at least it was said to be, the most critical and important in terms of where Russia's foreign policy attention should be drawn. Could you comment on the rest of the near abroad as it looks from the vantage point of April 1990, 2000?
The rest of the so-called near abroad, of course, is also important. It is less concentrated because all of them are. Georgia is important, Armenia important, Azerbaijan important, Kazakhstan important, Tajikistan important because of the variety of reasons. Generally, I also do agree that the most serious problems for national security of Russia are connected much more with the near abroad, and we are very much interested in the stability and political stability in near abroad. And I think that if any American administration will have as a goal the stabilization of our relationship with our close neighbors, it will be extremely foolish policy because it will backfire.
Could you name, since 1991, who in your opinion was the best foreign minister so far in Russia?
Well, of course, I have a lot of suggestions to Kozyrev of how the Russian policy should be changed. But still, I have the. But Andrei Kozyrev, of course, had his strong points and weak points. But what was important was that at least at the first years of his position in this job, he has a clear strategical perspective. What he would like to see, how he would like to see Russia in the world, which was realistic and correct.
The second part is, if you were to advise a possible President Putin about a foreign minister for the future, for this new direction, who would be in the group that you would suggest?
No, I would not comment on this. I have the position on this, but I would not comment.
Okay, fair enough. Michael?
I wanted to return to an aspect of culture. You talked before about one of the differences between Poland and Russia was the fact that in Poland there was much more recent experience of a market economy. And what occurred to me, of course, was that in Russia there had also been experience of market-like activities in the black market. And I'm curious what you think the effect on the post-communist market economy in Russia was of that long tradition and experience of the black market in Russia.
Well, black market economy was much better developed in Poland than in Soviet Union and in Russia. And from my point of view, it was the advantage of Poland. That they had the market economy partly legal, partly illegal, but they had a lot of the market experiences. Of course, Russia had some kind of semi-legal or illegal transactions, so-called pripiski, various types of the semi-barter trade, but major part of it was very much incorporated in the general structures of the socialist economy and played the role of the supplement to this. Really private sector in Russia was extremely small. It was so-called tsekhoviki, or real illegal private producers. And I know that a lot of, when and if you look now at a well-functioning small Russian production enterprise, and you would ask the owner of the enterprise what he was doing 10 or 15 years ago, in many cases you will find that he was tsekhovik. So it was the person who was operating in a really private, even if illegal, productive economy in the Soviet time. But it was a very, very limited sector of the economy.
So you don't think that the prevalence or the existence of the black economy had the effect of...
I think when and if there was such an experience, it really was brought. It was rather positive than negative.
Mm. Well, how do you deal, I mean, to turn to a related issue, which is the issue of criminality and corruption in Russia today. Do you think that the extent of corruption and criminality in Russia has been exaggerated in the Western media, and how serious a problem do you think it actually is?
Well, first of all, it is a very serious problem. It is a serious problem in our country, as in many others. If you are speaking about crime, crime is an extremely serious problem in the United States. It is a serious problem in Russia. Murder rate, I think, in the United States is similar to Russia. Of course, drug trafficking is much more serious here problem than in our case. Corruption, of course, to the bigger extent, the Russian problem than American. It's evident and understandable to everybody. So it is a very serious problem. It is overestimated only from my point of view. First of all, that it is discussed and analyzed out of the general context of the Russian life and Russian economy and Russian society. Like as if we would be discussing, like in Soviet times, American life in terms of mafia and organized crime, which was the part of the reality, but was not all of the reality. It was a serious part of the reality, unpleasant part of the reality, but very far from all of the reality. The same applies to Russia. It is a dangerous phenomenon which should be addressed very seriously by any responsible Russian authority. It is not imagination of the journalists, and it should not be dismissed. But also the picture in which you think that in Moscow, well, as it is many times the cases with those who had no chance to be there, that in Moscow all the time there is a shooting and murders, and you cannot walk by the streets, is very far from the reality. It's rather calm city, much calmer than many other in Europe.
Recently, a number of cases in which foreign investors have been dealt with harshly, shall we say, by Russian courts or other institutions, I think has reduced the enthusiasm a lot of foreign investors have. And I'm thinking in this case of the Lomonosov porcelain case, and also the Sedanko bankruptcy, and others. And I'm curious what steps you think the government can take, if any, to reassure foreign investors that their investments will in fact be protected.
I think that first of all, implementations of the court decisions when they are done and not implemented is important, like in Vyborgsky celluloсно-бумажный комбинат. The public acts for the support of the well-established. Well, I don't think that the government should interfere in the work of the legal system. It's the work of the companies to find the ways of defending their interests, doing it more professionally than they are doing at the present stage, not thinking that government itself will resolve the problem for them, not rushing for the prime minister, but hiring the good lawyers, as they are doing here. But also, of course, the changes in Russian legislations which are removing the possibility of the legal actions which are really putting in danger the interest of the good and respectable foreign investors, like changing in a civil code, which will remove the possibilities to use some irregularities in the privatization process, then to confiscate the property from the owner who is a bona fide owner and who never dealt with these irregularities, who never have nothing to do with them. The changes in joint stock company regulation, which will exclude the possibilities to ignore the minority rights and dilute the ownership, etc.
You mentioned the Vyborg pulp and paper case too, which certainly is less of a problem of the legal system than it is actually enforcing.
Yes, of course.
But it also identifies a political problem as well, which is the political fallout when foreign investors are viewed as likely to come in and lay off workers and otherwise. I mean, how serious is this as a political barrier or political impediment to foreign investment?
You should not hope that in Russia, if you would like to invest there, you will have enormous demonstration of people with the slogans, how happy we are that American investors come to buy our plant and to fire part of the people, etc. It's not done anywhere in the world, and I don't think it will be done in Russia. But everything depends on the dimension and the position of the government. In Vyborg, the situation is quite clear. There is a rule solution, rule of law should be reestablished, regardless of the political situation in Vyborg. Other way around, of course, you will not have any international investors. And it will be difficult for you to have local investments also. Yeah.
I'd like to return to this issue of culture. I agree with you that the basic political culture, of course, is the foundation on which all of these processes rest, and that it does take time. And you identified both last night and today some of the elements that are dysfunctional in the culture that was inherited from those many, many decades, much longer than in Eastern Europe, of Soviet power. I wonder, and this is purely speculative, I would invite you just to speculate, were there elements of that culture, however, that might be considered in some ways positive and that will be lost? For example, in spite of the enormous frequency of critical national elections, say from '89 through '96, in almost every case, there's been very high turnout, much higher than in the United States, where people are bored, where they don't care about issues. There are many reasons for that, recently called the vanishing voter. So you have a sense of politics which is deeply important to people. You have, my interest, as you might know, is in media and media audiences. You have a media public in Russia, which is the most, I would say, media literate, sophisticated public I have ever seen. And I mean whether or not they have college education. These are people who look at every frame of the television news and deconstruct it and look at it and understand it in ways that are extremely sophisticated, as opposed to being removed, bored, distracted, or increasingly in the United States, for example, not even watching news anymore. It was remarkable to me that during the election, that combining the two analysis programs of the weekend, the Daryenka and the Itorgi, that 60% of Russia was tuned in. This is so many times bigger than the Super Bowl, which is the largest in the event in the United States. It's extraordinary. I find this a really very interesting element of the culture. Now, my question is, do you think that along with the end of other aspects of the culture, as Russia becomes more normal, that this aspect will also become more normal and be lost in many ways?
I think yes. I think it will become more normal and it will be lost. Why? And it's normal, we have to accept it. What was the reasons behind so high turnover in the Russian elections? Why the Russian public is so intensely watching news? Because we have seen the process of an extremely radical change which touched the life of entire society. Because we have seen how politics could change life of your family, your children, your perspective, social positions, economic situation, priorities, etc. And when and if you have the feeling that politics could change your life entirely, and that is not the case in the States. Well, the American public, to the very serious extent, is realistic. That, well, nothing dramatic will change it in the States after next presidential elections or after the next Senate and Congress elections. Well, it could be a little bit better, a little bit worse, a little bit higher taxes, this composition of the tax cut, that composition of the tax cut. It does not touch the practical life of a normal American family to the serious extent. So, of course, I, as non-American citizen, would prefer American public as a force that has a strong influence on the policy of its country, to be more better educated, to understand more about foreign world, not to create too much problems for the foreign world on the basis of its low information about this world, etc. But it is, well, of course, it's my wishes. But the normal American family, of course, has the perception of the life in which politics play a very limited role. It is an enormous contrast to the normal Russian. I hope that we will be sometime dull country, that nothing will happen seriously in Russia, that in presidential elections will be dull, and we will be discussing the problem whether to increase personal income tax 2 percentage points or to decrease it 1 percentage point. And then the turnover will be lower, and the people will not be following news so intensively. And I think it will be better for Russia.
Could I just ask one last question, unless you and it is about your own personal culture. And I want to put in a plug for your extraordinary book of memoirs, which has just been published in the United States by the University of Washington Press. But how do you identify in your own personal culture, your upbringing, the points at which very critical principles were arrived at that set you on the direction that you have so heroically traversed in Russia. At what point in your own life could you see that you had made certain kinds of commitments which made you different from other people?
Well, I think it was to the very serious extent the matter of chance. It could be different way. Just happened to read the right books when it was not so easy, happened to find the right friends between my colleagues and be the member of the team, which was rather unique for Soviet Union of the early 80s, was in the right place to propose to the Yeltsin government that they have to think about the economy which is disintegrating, and felt that I could not avoid responsibility when I was proposed the position under the Russian government in the disintegrating Soviet Union.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.